Beautiful. Okay, so if you all don't mind turning your cameras on and then making sure that your name is correct on your Zoom profile so we know who we're calling on. And then remain muted until it's your turn to speak. And so if anyone is dialing in on the phone, I'm not sure if anyone is, but if you are, then dial *6. That's your mute, unmute. And then we'll have a few polls, which we'll walk through in a second here. And then there'll be some questions. And so there's a few different ways we're going to interact here. But the main thing is if you have something that you want to say, the way that we'll know that is if you use the raise your hand feature. So if you go to this reactions button at the bottom of the screen, it's a little smiley face. There is a button that says raise hand. So let us know if that isn't working for you, but that's how we'll know when you, if you want to speak. So, or ask a question or whatever, but you may also use the chat. I think you all have access to the chat, right?
Yes.
Great. So you can also type in a comment or a question in the chat. We'll be monitoring those too, and we'll address them as a part of the discussion best we can, and there'll be plenty more opportunities for feedback in the future. If we don't get to everyone's comments today, we'll have focus groups, survey, another round of public meetings. We have an email account, social media, and I'll talk about all that stuff at the end. So we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so here's the three things. We'll do online polling and we'll walk through this first one together. And like I said, you can use the chat and then raise your hand if you would like to speak or ask a question. Next. As a reminder, here are our participation principles. So by being in this conversation together, we are all collectively agreeing to these. And we will be enforcing these these principles. So please be respectful of one another by following these. Next. So here's our first poll. So if we could get the link to the poll in the chat. So you're not going to click on the screen. You're going to get a separate link that you can either use in your browser or you can use on your phone. So that was just Elsa put it in the chat. So if you put that in your browser, or you can do it in your phone, it will bring up the survey and then we'll answer some questions this way. So it'll be a big map. And then on that map, you will click an area that you are most familiar with. And it will show up on this map. There we go. Is anyone having issues or have questions about it? That stuff popping up all over the place. Great. So this meeting today, we are going to try to focus a little more on the northern half of the corridor. We wanted to be able to have as interactive of a discussion as possible. So we didn't want to try to cover the entire corridor at once. But if you are not, if this time happened to work for you, we'll talk about anything and everything, depending on who's here and what they want to talk about. All right. We are going to have more poll questions. So if anyone is having issues, let us know now because we want to be able to include you in the polls as we go into the discussion. All right. Great. Okay, let's do the next slide. That was just a warm up. So, this, as a reminder, you are here because you selected land use and development as the topic you are most interested in discussing. So we will talk about each of the principles that we presented earlier in the presentation and then have a discussion about why or why not we agree with those as principles. So we go to the next slide, we'll hit another poll. So this is the principle that we're talking about right now. So to celebrate and enhance the corridor's unique assets. So if we go to the next one, that is the poll. So now if you have that poll up, if you agree with that planning principle, hit agree. If you partially agree, B. Disagree, C. And if you partially agree or disagree, we want to know why. So there will be follow-up on that. Okay. Arnold, we see you. Western and Lawrence, thank you. All right. Anyone want to disagree or partially agree before we move on? I think this is a pretty easy one. I didn't expect this to be controversial. Okay, let's go. Let's go to the next one. So this next piece, we'll start to get into a little bit more discussion. So this one is about concentrating development into the vibrant mixed use hubs. And so that's talking about, you know, the difference of trying to maintain a full 5 miles consistent commercial corridor. You know, it's very hard to keep a commercial corridor healthy for 5 miles in length. We see a lot of vacancy along the corridor. We've heard that from people. We've seen that in our analysis. And so this principle talks about, well, let's try to concentrate that activity at these mixed use hubs, because that's where they're most likely to be successful. So if we could go to the next one, let's vote on that, and then I'll have some follow-up questions. All right, we got to partially agree. Oh, 50-50. I'll give you a couple more minutes to agree or not, but just be prepared that if you say partially agree, we're going to ask you why, and we'll talk about it. Uh-oh. All right, so someone that said partially agree, could you raise your hand? And or if you want to type in the chat, that's also fine. We want to hear why partially agree and what we need to change to get you to fully agree. So to raise your hand, it's the reactions at the very bottom. There's a smiley face with a plus. You click on that and then there'll be a raise hand button. Is anyone having trouble seeing that, or are you being shy? If you're having trouble using the raise hand, you can also just unmute yourself at this point, since no one else is trying to talk.
Okay, I'm having difficulty here. I agree, but you know, I'm going to have a bit of difficulty trying to get to what you're trying to say or do or workflow step.
Can you elaborate? I'm not sure what the question is.
I think I was trying to vote and I was unable to vote, but I would be in agreement. Yeah, you're trying to maintain 5 miles. There's no way in God's green earth that you're going to be able to do that. No one can.
Yes. All right, great. Thank you, Tim. Jan, you unmuted. Did you have something to say?
I put it in the chat, but I just want to know what happens to the areas that are not steering to the hubs.
Yeah, so that will be the next piece, is what do those in-between areas look like? And, you know, spoiler alert, we'll be talking about housing as how we use those areas to optimize for additional housing capacity.
So I had a question.
Yeah.
It seems as though, at least just thinking about Western Avenue, where these mixed-use hubs would be most natural to be located are also locations that are very unfriendly to pedestrians because they're very wide, not just across Western, but also across the intersecting corridors. And I guess I would be interested in where would you be envisioning that a cohesive mixed-use hub could be located, given that the street widths on both east-west as well as Western Avenue are rather wide at the locations where they might be naturally be located.
Yeah, very fair. And that's why, these three themes that we have of land use and development, mobility in the public realm, and then sustainability and resilience, all of those overlap and reinforce one another. So we would imagine that we would want to pair any kind of recommendations for additional development intensity with improvements to, sidewalks, crosswalks, bicycle crossings, all that stuff, so that there would be more of an actual public realm rather than kind of a skinny sidewalk next to essentially a highway. And that would help, support the success of these mixed use nodes, because if they're not accessible, then they're not going to be able to thrive in the way that I think we would like them to. So there's a few criteria that go into where those might be located. And so, transit, so especially around the Brown Line, but around some of the other major transit intersections along the corridor where there's already, some good commercial activity that you could build onto, and when there's already some kind of pedestrian activity. So those are the types of criteria that we're looking at this point. But we will also, just as point of reference, we will have a second round of focus groups that I'll talk about at the end, where we'll talk about some of these hubs in more detail of exactly how to apply some of these principles in a specific place in those specific conditions.
We should definitely talk about that, because I'm looking at a whole mile long of Western Avenue that is dedicated to nothing but automobiles.
Yeah.
It exists. How do we fix that? Even though the adjacent community may not appreciate that as much.
Yeah, so here's a question and something that we've been wondering about. So one area where that is true with the automobile uses is around the Toyota dealership. I think that's up by Peterson. And there has been an increasing number of auto-oriented businesses coming in there. So it's now like very much a cluster of auto-focused uses. Would we want to have a place along the corridor where we'd want to suggest some of those things congregate together, rather than trying to have them intermixed with other types of uses where it's not as compatible? Should we just lean in and call it a car zone?
Well, that's what
that would be unfortunate for the people that live in that community, that would be forced to live with a community of auto repair places, as opposed to having a mixed use with, retail, restaurant ad nauseum.
Well, some of these places are already entirely auto oriented. So
I agree with that.
I'm not sure that it's going to make a huge difference. And there's certainly areas that are better served as mixed use, or as residential, or as neighborhood services, things like that. But those types of uses, those auto uses, need to go somewhere. And Western Avenue isn't a terrible spot for it, because it's pretty accessible to the rest of the region.
I do agree with you.
Yeah.
There is no argument there.
Yeah. So it's just a matter of where might those be located, because otherwise they're just going to kind of smatter in with everything else. And that's going to cause more headaches, I think.
I think there is some possibility. I mean, as we've seen over the last decades, the number of auto businesses has actually shrunk quite considerably. So there are some there, but there are some long-term trends. So a little like what's happened with retail and big box. CarMax has decimated all of those used car lots that used to be, there used to be more car sales and car service on Western Avenue than there is today. So I think we anticipate that trend's continuing. And then, it's interesting, a lot of the space is actually taken up by taxi businesses. So there's taxi storage. And of course, given Uber, given Lyft, given what's happened over the last year with many drivers leaving the taxi business because there was no business, it'll be interesting to see what happens with those, because they may be less viable. So we may see some of those sites consolidate, become available over the next 5 or 10 years. And so we want to anticipate that, and particularly where those sites are close to some of the hubs we're talking about, or where they may be opportune for community housing in the future. It'll be interesting to kind of
I
anticipate.
agree with the 5 or 10 year picture, but the short term is you're dealing with the automotive constituency, and they're a powerful group along Western Avenue.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, can we go to the next slide, please? So this will also be a poll, but just so you can see the photos a little bit better, we have some photos of different types of development that might go in some of these mixed use hubs. So we're looking at, so this isn't necessarily about the design of any of these things. So if you don't like the architectural style, like, don't worry about it. We'll cover that when we talk about the focus areas, when we get into more of the specifics for the geography, but more about the scale, the types of uses. And so in one case, there's a Walmart, so a grocery store. Some of these are smaller scale. The buildings are different scales. So that in the bottom right in Rogers Park, we're dealing with much smaller building footprints than some of the other ones, like in the top left. That's one big building. It can be articulated so it doesn't look like it's one gigantic box. But we're talking about a different scale, and we probably don't have a lot of lots, frankly, that could handle a building of that size. But just would like to see if we could go to the poll and see if folks would like to vote on which of these. So they'll show up, you'll see them better on in your browser. So you can select as many of these that you like as you want to, and then just don't select the ones you don't like. And again, we're looking at the types of uses, the scale, not necessarily the building design. I'm seeing a lot for B and D. Does anyone want to say why they like or don't like something, and maybe where they think that would be most appropriate?
The buildings are all the right height. It's like we're in Michigan or something. Sorry, bad joke with a Romney reference.
Anyone else want to comment on the buildings? We can also move on to our more specific housing discussion if there aren't any more things that people want to talk about here. But I think what I'm getting out of this from these themes is that, and please tell me if this is an incorrect assessment, is that people are like this kind of more granular scale of mixed use, would like to see at least a few stories of residential on top of some kind of commercial. Any other things that stood out to folks that seem like I should mention? All right, let's go to the next one then. So this is one where we'll talk more specifically about housing, and we're talking about housing in kind of 3 contexts. For sure, in the mixed use hubs, housing would be part of that. It would be on top of, some kind of commercial or other type of use. The question that came up earlier about, well, what happens in between these hubs? One thing that the team noticed through the analysis, as well as what we heard from people, is that there's a lot of vacancy in between some of these areas, but we've also seen trends that this area, the population is growing faster than the city as a whole in these neighborhoods just adjacent to Western Avenue. So there could be an opportunity to increase housing and things like affordable housing or other types of housing, which we'll talk about kind of what we think the types of housing should be. along the corridor, kind of in between those hubs. So one way to do it is new housing, like what we're seeing here, where it's housing all the way to the ground floor. And then another type, which we'll talk about next, is converting existing spaces into ground floor housing that haven't been housing traditionally. So if we want to go to the poll, so let us know what you think about encouraging housing in between those hubs. In our previous discussions, just full disclosure, there was certainly different opinions about this. Some people felt that that housing is just maybe not that appealing on Western Avenue. But also some people are very supportive because they'd rather have some productive use there rather than just a bunch of vacant storefronts and buildings and empty lots. All right, anyone who partially agrees, do you want to let us know why?
Sure. I partially agreed only because I moved away from Ukrainian Village after 12 years because the community was overdeveloped with single family $1 million homes, and a lot of people were priced out of the neighborhood. So I think it's important to keep mixed housing and different availabilities.
So when you say mixed housing, can you just elaborate a little bit on what you mean by that?
Sure, more than just a bunch of super expensive single family homes, you know, affordable housing, rental units, multi-unit condos and things like that. Something in everyone's budget, you know?
Yeah. Absolutely. Any others want to speak up on this? All right. Well, we can go to the next one where we'll dive a little bit deeper into that. So this is, oh, well, we'll look at these types of housing. So why don't we go to the poll? So this starts to get at what some of that housing could look like. And again, it's not necessarily about design per se, it's more about scale. So for example, there are the C actually does have some single family homes, or I guess they could be converted to flats. Some are different scales. Interesting that A isn't getting any votes. Oh, there we go. Is the reason that E isn't getting votes is because it is too tall? And while you're doing that, I'm just looking at the chat here. So Arnold, you asked about the taxi parking along the cemetery sanctioned by the city. I don't think there's any kind of contract. I think they just do it because it's open city parking, street parking. Then the question about being realistic about developments until we get a handle on crime and people feeling safe living and working here. Absolutely. That's got to be part of it. Part of it is creating actual destinations that are kind of 24-hour places so that there's more eyes on the street. It's not quite the desolate wasteland that sometimes Western Avenue can look like. And then evenings here, starting to get some more positive activity to counter that. And then Arnold was saying the higher density housing might be challenging north of Bryn Mawr because there's not as much transit. Yes. So that's something that we'll need to keep in mind when we think about some of these different areas, is that because 5 miles is very long. So there'll be different conditions along those areas, and we'll want to think about what's most appropriate given those specific conditions. So does anyone want to speak up about why they don't like E? Or why they do like something else? Arnold, you're saying that Yeah, you think that one's too much density north of Bryn Mawr. Yep. So, and then Jan asked how much parking would be accommodated with higher density housing. And that's something that's an interesting question. So right now, there is something called a transit serve location overlay that goes from, it's along Western Avenue, but it only goes to Foster, no further north, where you have the possibility of having significantly reduced parking requirements. So you could have up to 50% of your parking as of right. You don't have to meet that requirement, and then you can get it down to 0 in certain circumstances. So so some ways that parking, so if you're around a lot of transit where it's very high transit, we want to provide very good access to that transit, a good pedestrian environment so that people can easily get to and from the transit, making that the most attractive option. We want to improve bus service and the infrastructure along Western Avenue to allow more frequent, reliable bus service so that there doesn't need to be as much parking. But of course, there also can be parking in some of these buildings depending on where it's located and what the needs are. So theoretically that can be located in a parking structure integrated into the building, if there's not some other parking solution. But that most of these mixed use buildings like this that's what they're doing, and some of the larger housing developments.
Just want to use this time as a time check. We have about 12 minutes remaining.
All right, let's.
Breakout group.
Thanks, BJ. Let's move on to the next one. All right, so this is the next piece of the housing puzzle. So we're taking it a step further. We talked about integrating it into mixed use, and then we talked about having it be new, like developing new housing in underutilized sites along the corridor in between those hubs. And now in the areas where there's already existing buildings that have vacant ground floor space, would we want to convert some of those or encourage some of those to be converted to housing? So we have some examples here of what that could look like. And if you would like to vote, that would be great. While you're doing that, Tim, you say it doesn't look like your building choices are neighborhood specific. Totally agree. And that's why the next phase, when we talk about the specific focus areas where we get into the geography, we'll get into much more specifics. We are talking at a very high general level right now about principles and general direction. But it's very much acknowledged that there's a lot of diversity and conditions along the length of this, and we will get into that in the next phase. Phil, you talk about there are not safe rental options for seniors who want to sell their homes and stay in the neighborhood. That's helpful. There is the Northtown Library that has senior housing in it, but I don't know that there's much else along the stretch.
There really isn't. And this is Phil. And the other thing he mentioned is they wanted something that's safe and that's also rental. Because I found in mixed use developments, when you have condos on top of retail, the retail doesn't stay there and the condos get difficult to sell. In Chicago, we have found condo sales still have not gone back and reached their 2008 and 2009 high prices.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. That's helpful background. And I believe we've heard a little bit of interest from senior housing developers that might want to locate. So one thing that we could talk about as a part of the study is recommend some of those locations where it would be most appropriate for uses like that. So that when private developers do want to locate, they know areas where the community, the city, would be generally supportive. That would make them more likely to want to move forward. There's less uncertainty about if they'll be able to do what they want to do. Does anyone have anything to ask or say about ground floor conversions? Okay, so Ellie, you asked about rezonings, eminent domain, TIF, city property redeveloped. So that'll be in kind of the implementation phase. So we will get into that a little bit more. One option for sure could be, rezoning or kind of defining what types of uses we'd like to see where based on this kind of community consensus that we're building. I would very much doubt that there would be any kind of eminent domain situation. We don't have that much city property along the corridor, unlike other corridors in the city. On the north side especially, we just don't have a lot. So the only one that I can think of that's directly on the corridor is the 4715 Northwestern, which is at Western and Leland. There's currently an affordable housing development proposed there. But we don't know the result of that. So unlike in some of the south and west sides where they're bundling city land with private land in some cases and moving forward with developments, here on Western Avenue, it's almost all privately held. So it's more of providing guidance and sharing the vision from the community and setting in place other incentives to try to get what we would like to see there. All right. Okay. So yeah, if you could take a look at these conversions really quick and do a quick vote on which of them you like and would not like, and maybe why. We do have 2 minutes. So if anyone wants to speak up on what you like or don't like, would love to hear that. Not a fan of C, Phil. Chris, do you know what the story with C is?
Yeah, it's actually relatively nearby. It's on North Levitt. So, it's really interesting. Like some of these are examples that are on kind of more significant corridors. So B is on Lincoln Avenue, but some of the other ones are actually just in neighborhood streets, and they were the corner tavern or the corner store, and gradually got converted as people started going to grocery stores and kind of using different kinds of retail. But C is, it's just an interesting example where they use the glass block. And I think, again, as with the other examples, we're not recommending, design specifics, but these are just interesting examples to demonstrate that it's something that's happened in Chicago for some time. And, with some of our kind of, more valuable and valued older historic buildings on Western Avenue, this is an alternative. This is, we're just demonstrating that it's a way that it can be done. And often there are approaches that look at kind of reducing maybe the transparency on the ground floor, so there's a little more privacy. So it transitions from a kind of a storefront design to more of a residential space. But great opportunities for creativity.
Phil, do you want to elaborate on it's been a disaster on Toohey?
Yeah.
I think we all realize, people who are familiar with the neighborhood, how bad Toohey Avenue has been for the last 15 to 20 years. And there's been no real development there. They've tried reusing the storefronts. The only thing they've been attractive in is in just attracting religious institutions, and the properties are not being maintained. It's not realistic to say, oh, we're going to be able to turn all of this into single living, multi-used housing for people on the first floor when they're afraid to even go outside and walk in their neighborhood. I think what we need to do and get buy-in from the aldermen, all 4 of them, is them taking some of that, is it called the money what's that money called that each person, the 1.3 million they get each year to spend in their ward?
Oh, the menu funds?
The menu funds,
Yeah. Mhm.
to put some of that together and to get some size of scale so we can turn some of this around. It's been left to fester for 15 to 20 years. Western's been going bad. TUI is already bad. We can't fix our main nodes like Western when TUI is allowed to fester.
Yes.
Phil,
Go ahead. Go ahead, Arnold.
Oh, hi, Phil. I'll be kind of curious as to, yeah, I'm familiar with TUI to some extent, but I'm not familiar with what you mean by it's been festering or that it's been declining. Is it the condition of the buildings? Is it the condition of the roadway? Is it the,
It's all of the above. If you look at, for example, TUI in California, that should be a main node. It's not. And the corner businesses that have tried to move in there, it's only the 7-Eleven and the cash exchange service are the stable businesses there. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, Norman's saying the lack of demand for commercial space is the overarching problem. Yes, so we definitely see that in general, Chicago has a lot more retail space than it can actually support. And when we think about kind of this vision, we're talking about, you know, a very long-term vision. So we're looking, you know, 20 years out. So we're looking at what are the incremental steps we need to take in the short term, and what could that roadmap look like to get to 20 years from now, where, you know, conditions could be very different. Obviously, we need to build a lot of flexibility into that because we don't know exactly what's going to happen. But yes.
What makes Devon so successful and TUI so unsuccessful?
I also add it's
go ahead.
critical. I also add, as Torrance, that part of the issue underlying is as well is that there has been tax incentives to keep certain places vacant within their storefronts. So it's been hard to influence and predict property owners in selling their retail spots for affordable for folks who can actually afford retail, as well as ensuring that they're not just sitting on them. So it's been part of the issue we've all been facing here, especially here on the north side.
Thank you, Torrance. Anything else? BJ, are we at time almost? I think it might kick us out in a second.
We have 1 minute.
1 minute, okay. Yes, so Norman hit it on the head of Devon being a cultural destination, that there's, you know, really a place there that doesn't exist in the case of TUI. So Chris, I was wondering if you could give the themes, just a couple of minutes of the themes when we report out at the end, when we leave our breakout group. Okay. Yeah. Any final thoughts before we get booted out of here? Or questions, or
There's a
anything that
lot
we've
of
left
work
out?
to do.
Oh, yeah.
That's a final thought, isn't it? I think it counts.
Yes, that is for sure. We have our work cut out for us, but the good news is that we're all in it together.
You may be. I'm going to Mexico. Have a good one. Bye.
So Norman says extend the Western Avenue bus to the yellow line. I think transit would have a big difference, would make a big difference in our development potential up here. All right, so it looks like we're going to be kicked out in 54 seconds. I want to thank you all for participating. It's been great to have you join, and we will see you on the other side, but just make sure that you're signed up for our email list. You can email us at westernav@cityofchicago.org. And we will get back to you ASAP. Mijay, did you have something?
Yeah, I want to say that this is not the end. We're going to regroup with everyone else. So don't sign off, please.
Yes, don't go away. Stay with us. Right, we will see you on the other side.